The passage was narrow and low. If not dwarfs, then certainly not legionaries, but even they had to bend almost half their height. 2 men worked in front. They chiseled heavy stone earth, gasping from dust, spitting blood, swearing dirty words, passed full pots of earth to those behind them, and those further up, from hand to hand. It was impossible to work more than an hour in front. They were changing. During 24 hours of continuous work, all sappers' hands became like a bloody mess. It was painful to touch, but they continued to dig their hands into the hard wall. On the 8th day, a noise was heard below, somewhere very deep. One of the first men raised his hand and everyone froze. For a minute there was a grave silence. One could hear the dust settling, the thick, heavy lashes of dust falling down. The noise came again. It was as if it had gotten closer. Then another, and closer still. The chief, he was in the 4th row, pointed downward with his thumb. The first men understood at once and thrust their picks right under their feet. Down below they heard it too and fell silent. But it didn't matter. The sappers continued methodically hammering the ground beneath them. They changed in the same way. 1 pair for an hour, then another, and so on. Soon those who were in front hid in the ground already waist deep. The hole was growing in depth. And there was silence below, but the chief knew that soon there would be a breakthrough, that the earth would collapse and the sappers would fall into another passage, into the tunnel that others were digging, those who were below. It was important to guess when it would happen. And the chief guessed. He left the 2 freshest in front and sent the rest upstairs, and instead of the sappers, warriors came down the passage. No helmets, no shields, but swords, short darts, knives. They were to be the first to rush into the gap and destroy those below, and then seal the passageway forever, never to be remembered again. The powerful blow of the pickaxe met with little resistance, and the remnants of earth fell down. A void. The hole was widened. The sappers, ducking, slid backward with desert snakes, their place taken by the first 2 legionnaires, the most experienced, the most desperate. They had already had to cut heads on the walls a couple of days ago when the Persians tried to climb up using the ladders. They were good at cutting heads at the top. They had no doubt that they would do just as well down below, underground. Without delay, the 2 men jumped down. It wasn't very high, just like upstairs, and exactly the same circle of white light at the end of the passage, only on the other side. Cautiously, swords out, the first 2 walked forward. Slowly they went. More were coming from above. They began to press their backs. They weren't going to go all the way to the end of the passageway. They would be outnumbered there. They wanted to just get to the enemy sappers, destroy them, and then get away so they could then just clobber the passageway. But there were no sappers. There was no one. A narrow passage, a circle of light and silence. Run away, all of them. The warriors wanted to go back like. Either there was a niche in the wall or something else, but suddenly the darkness spit out a huge Persian. How did he even fit in here? Growling, the Persian lunged forward, trying to impale the first of the Romans with his sword. Though narrow, though cramped, the first dodged, and the second gently thrust the blade of a long knife just below his chin. The Persian unclenched the hilt, began to settle down, and then, "Smoke!" shouted the first warrior. And the desperate coughing began, the pale beam stretching from far away, from the very beginning of the tunnel, from its source, rippled in black waves. Like Medusa's hair, they grew thicker and thicker, fuller and thicker, and corrosive. The walls of the tunnel shuddered with loud, violent coughing. Eyes went blind, and lungs burst into thousands of red living shreds. The first to collapse to the ground were those in front, followed by everyone else. The sappers standing above, near the failure, shouted. But they were answered only by coughs. Then the smoke began to answer. They rushed upstairs. There were no survivors. The passage was blocked, along with the 24 soldiers who were below. Hundreds of years later, they were found. In a narrow passage under one of the towers of the ancient city of Dura-Europos rested the remains of 19 Romans and 1 Persian. Human bones, fragments of weapons, equipment, clothing, and tarnished coins. They also found traces of bitumen and sulfur, the ingredients of the first-ever chemical warfare agent. A new dynasty was established in Persia and the surrounding lands, which was descended from the legendary priest Sasan, who later became known as the Sassanids. Having disposed of the weak Parthian state, the new Persian Shahanshah, king of kings Ardashir-Papakan, gazed eastward and westward. As one of the Roman historians wrote, this eastern despot dreamed of the exploits of Cyrus, Darius the Great, and Xerxes, dreamed of restoring the vast Achaemenid Empire from India to the Aegean Sea, and began an almost uninterrupted series of wars between Persia and Rome in which fortune smiled at one or the other side. Ardashir's cause was continued by his son Shapur, who managed to defeat the Romans in big battles, to plunder rich eastern provinces, to take away thousands of captives to the east. In 253, Shapur began the second campaign to the west. The Persians captured important cities in Roman Mesopotamia, Nisibis and Carrhae, defeated the Roman troops in the Battle of Barbalissa, and then entered Syria. Thanks to the treachery of one of the city officials, the great city of Antioch was captured without serious effort and without much bloodshed. The Persians penetrated further, into Cilicia and Cappadocia. Then, after brutal plunder, Shapur returned to the Euphrates and captured several border Roman fortresses and cities. Dura-Europos, one of the most impregnable cities, also fell. But soon Emperor Valerian appeared in Syria. He managed to clear from Persians territories to the west from Euphrates, moreover, as it seems, Shapur, and did not intend to join these lands to the power. Roman troops again entered Antioch, and soon Dura-Europos was liberated. A large Roman garrison was again stationed there. Its basis was the 20th Palmyra cohort, which stood in the city before, and helped her vexations from the legions stationed nearby. The 4th Scythian, the 3rd Cyrenaic, the 16th Standing Flavius, and some others. The soldiers were numerous. They made up at least a third of the city's population of 7,000. The walls, and especially the long and therefore vulnerable western wall, were tidied up and further fortified. Because no one in Dura-Europos, Antioch, or even Rome doubted that Shapur would visit again. So it happened. In the beginning of 256th year, in one of the sunny and habitually hot days, on the horizon showed a yellow-red cloud of dust. A huge Persian army was approaching the city. Shahanshah Shapur personally led a new campaign. Although the army of Shahanshah was huge, the defenders of the city had reason to hope that the city would resist. It would be protected by nature, the valor of the defenders, and the gods. It is not without reason that the word Dura is translated from Aramaic as fortress. This fortress was built in ancient times, either by Babylonians or Assyrians, but back then it was just a fortified, unremarkable place, just Dura. Seleucus Nicator, general of Alexander the Great, founder of the Seleucid dynasty, breathed new life into this place. In about 300th year, the fortress of Dura turns into the city of Dura-Europos, with a rectangular layout of streets, with temples, with a theater, with a columned agora, and other delights of the Greco-Macedonian world. Being in the depths of the Seleucid power, the city lost its defensive value but gained trade. The population grew, and Greek and Macedonian colonists were joined by Syrians, Jews, and Phoenicians. Caravan trade between east and west flourished. Dura-Europos was an important transshipment base on this caravan route. But the Seleucid state began to decline and lose land. In the middle of the century, Dura-Europos was captured by the Parthians. However, in the life of the inhabitants of the city on the Euphrates, little changed. Greek Macedonian elite remained in power. Trade still brought local merchants solid income. Except that added Oriental flavor, next to the Greek temples began to grow monuments to Eastern cults. Temple of Mithras, statues of Baal, images of the great Syrian goddess Astargatis. 300 years later, the power in the city changed again during another war with the Parthians. Dura-Europos was occupied by the legions of the Roman commander Avidius Cassius, the winner of the Parthian king Vologeses III. However, for the city on the Euphrates, the new power hardly brought anything good. Dura-Europos was slowly but surely beginning to decline. Trade between the Roman Empire and the Parthian kingdom was weak, and the two powers were much more often at war. This could not but affect the city life. Traders and craftsmen were replaced by soldiers. Dura-Europos again became Dura, a fortress protecting the eastern borders of the empire. However, the Parthians were not able to test the strength of the impregnable walls. They left this mission to their successors, Persians. About the siege of Dura-Europos, there is absolutely no information in written sources. Ancient authors in general are scarce in commenting on the events of those years. They, even about the capture of Antioch by Shapur, report briefly, and as if in passing, what to say about such an insignificant border fortification, which was Dura-Europos. We know the evidence of the intense and violent struggle at the city walls only thanks to the rich archaeological finds discovered by the Franco-American expedition. Dura-Europos has come to be called the Syrian Pompeii. So much marvelous archaeological material has fallen into the hands of scientists. Among other things were discovered and traces of an underground battle in which 19 Romans and 1 Persian were killed. On 3 sides the city was impregnable. On the east, the high bank of the Euphrates, on the north and south, steep cliffs. The Persian army approached the city wall, which protected Dura-Europos from the west. Here it was possible to use battering rams, build embankments, attempt to storm with ladders, and dig undercrofts. Probably, Shapur tried to seize the city immediately, but all attempts of storming were repulsed. The Romans shot well, and in close combat on the walls, they were not equal at all. And after the first failures, Shahanshah decided to declare the garrison of Dura-Europos underground war. The Persians began to dig an undercut under the tower number 19, located slightly north of the Palmyra Gate. The Persians were going to reinforce the dungeon under the tower with wooden structures and set them on fire, so that the tower would collapse and the assault troops would have a breach in the city wall. At first, the tunnel builders were successful. The Romans did not notice anything. However, apparently it did not last long. When the Persians' intentions became clear, the garrison commander ordered the construction of a counter-underground passage, which would go a little higher than the enemy's tunnel. This tournament lasted probably not 1 week, and the Persians were ahead of the Romans. The meeting of the 2 squads of sappers occurred right under the tower. It was here that the remains of 20 soldiers were discovered. And when the enemy groups met, the Persians, if we believe the hypothesis of a scientist from the University of Leicester, used a new terrible weapon, set fire to a mixture of bitumen and sulfur, and with the help of either mechs or special siphons directed the poisonous smoke into the tunnel. The Roman dungeon was higher, the draft was good, so the chemical attack was successful. 24 Roman soldiers died in seconds. However, the Persians did not achieve their goal. The Romans managed to collapse the dungeon, and the tower was practically unharmed, except for a little sagging. This failure, of course, could not stop Shapur. He orders to build a new dig, at the southern end of the western wall. Here the Persians managed a little more, but not all. The tower collapsed, but the Romans were able to very quickly seal the breach in the fortifications and eliminate the threat. The decisive value was the 3rd subcave, which led not under the towers or walls but inside the city, and it was built so that an assault team could pass through it. This dungeon defenders Dura-Europos, unlike the previous 2 failed to discover, the Romans this time were not ready. Apparently, at night, saboteurs nailed behind the walls, opened the gates, and the main part of the army of Shapur rushed into the city. Dura-Europos fell, and given that there is no evidence of fighting inside the city, we can assume that after the Persians penetrated into the city, the garrison capitulated rather quickly. Lines of prisoners rattling chains stretched to the east. Probably Shapur could have turned Dura-Europos into his own fortified point on the border with the Roman possessions, but he did not do it. The city was abandoned and never revived again. After some time, the last inhabitants left it, and the wars of Persia and Rome continued for a long time. Shapur, in the battle on the plain between Edessa and Kars, defeated the army of Valerian and took the Roman emperor in captivity. A little later, Antioch was taken and plundered for the 2nd time in a short time. In those years, the Roman Empire, torn by the crisis, had no strength to resist the eastern onslaught, and if it were not for the king of Palmyra, Odenath, who managed to inflict on the Persians some very sensitive blows, maybe the dream of the Persian kings about the revival of the great Achaemenid power would have come true.